Margaret Chen stood at her mailbox on December 10th, the same day it always arrived. For 35 years, like clockwork, the card came. Always the second week of December. Always a vintage Christmas card. The kind with elaborate Victorian scenes. Angels with gold leaf wings. Snow-covered churches with stained glass windows glowing warm against winter night. And always the same message, written in elegant script I remember. No signature, no return address. Postmarked from different cities each year. Sometimes Chicago, sometimes Portland, once from a small town in Montana Margaret had never heard of. Just those 2 words, I remember. Margaret had kept every single card, 35 of them, stored carefully in a wooden box in her study. She'd examined them over the years, looking for clues, patterns, anything that might tell her who sent them or why. She'd never figured it out. The cards had started arriving in 1990, when Margaret was 25. 5 years after her mother's death. 5 years after the worst Christmas of Margaret's life, when Helen Chen had fallen down the stairs at their family's holiday party and broken her neck. An accident, everyone said. Tragic, but accidental. Margaret had grieved, had eventually moved forward with her life, had learned to live with the loss. But every December the card arrived. I remember. A reminder that someone else remembered too, someone who'd been there perhaps, someone who'd known her mother, someone keeping a connection alive across decades and distance. It had become almost comforting, in a strange way, an annual ritual. Proof that Helen Chen hadn't been forgotten, even if Margaret didn't know who was doing the remembering. Today Margaret opened her mailbox and found the familiar vintage card inside. But when she opened it, her hands began to shake. The message was different. It's time you knew the truth about 1985. Your mother didn't fall, she was pushed. And I saw who did it. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the card in front of her, her tea growing cold. 35 years of, I remember. And now this. Your mother didn't fall, she was pushed. Margaret's mind reeled. Her mother's death had been investigated, briefly, perfunctorily. An accidental fall during a crowded Christmas party. Helen had been at the top of the stairs. Someone said she'd been drinking. She hadn't, not really, just 1 glass of wine. She'd lost her balance, she'd fallen. Tragic. Accidental. Closed case. But someone was saying it wasn't an accident. Someone was saying it was murder. Margaret turned the card over, looking for more information. On the back, in the same elegant script. If you want to know what really happened, go to 847 Maple Street, Unit 3B. Come alone. Bring the cards. An address. In the same city where Margaret lived, where her mother had died. Margaret looked at the box of 35 cards, no, 36, that sat on her table. Someone had been sending her these cards for 35 years, waiting, watching, remembering. And now they wanted to tell her the truth. Margaret's hands were still shaking, but she reached for her phone. Then stopped. Come alone. Whoever this was had kept silent for 35 years, had sent cryptic messages annually instead of just telling the truth. There had to be a reason. Fear, maybe, protection, danger. Margaret needed to know who had sent the cards, needed to know what really happened to her mother. She grabbed her coat, put all 36 cards in her bag, and headed for the address. 847 Maple Street was an older apartment building on the edge of town. Margaret climbed to the 3rd floor, found Unit 3B, and knocked. The door opened slowly. An elderly woman stood there, thin, frail, probably in her 80s. She had kind eyes that filled with tears when she saw Margaret. You came, the woman said softly. I wasn't sure you would. Who are you? Margaret asked. My name is Elizabeth Park. I was your family's housekeeper for 15 years until, she trailed off, until your mother died. Margaret's breath caught. Elizabeth. She remembered the name vaguely. A quiet woman who'd worked for her parents, who'd always been kind to Margaret when she was a child. You sent the cards, Margaret said. Every year, Elizabeth confirmed. I wanted you to know someone remembered, that your mother mattered, that what happened to her, she stopped, struggling with emotion, that it wasn't forgotten. What happened to her? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elizabeth stepped aside. Come in. It's time I told you everything. Elizabeth's apartment was small but tidy. She made tea, her hands shaking almost as much as Margaret's, and they sat at a small table by the window. I've been sick, Elizabeth said quietly. Cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. And I realized, I can't take this secret with me. You deserve to know the truth about your mother. Margaret gripped her teacup. Tell me. Elizabeth took a breath. Your mother didn't fall down those stairs by accident. She was pushed. I saw it happen. The words hung in the air between them. Who? Margaret managed. Your aunt, Caroline. Margaret's world tilted. Aunt Caroline, her mother's younger sister. She'd been at the party that night. She'd been devastated by Helen's death, had cried at the funeral, had... Why? Margaret whispered. Elizabeth's face was pained. Your father and Caroline were having an affair, had been for almost a year. Your mother found out that night. Christmas Eve, 1985. She found them together in your father's study during the party. Margaret felt sick. Your mother confronted them, Elizabeth continued. I was in the hallway, cleaning up glasses from the party. I heard shouting. Saw your mother come out of the study, crying. Caroline followed her. They argued at the top of the stairs. Elizabeth's hands trembled around her teacup. Caroline told your mother to keep quiet, that no one needed to know, that they could all move past it. Your mother said no. Said she was going to tell everyone. Was going to leave your father. Was going to make sure everyone knew what they'd done. And then? Margaret's voice was hollow. Caroline pushed her, Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face. Not hard, maybe. Maybe she just meant to. I don't know. But your mother was at the top of the stairs, and Caroline pushed her, and she fell. The image burned into Margaret's mind. Her mother, the stairs. The fall that everyone said was an accident. Your father came out right after, Elizabeth continued. He saw what happened. And instead of calling for help, instead of telling the truth, he helped Caroline stage it. Moved your mother's body slightly. Made it look like she'd just lost her balance. Told everyone it was an accident. You saw all this, Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. And you said nothing? Elizabeth's face crumpled. I was terrified. I was an immigrant, Margaret. My visa was tied to my work permit. Your father, he saw me in the hallway. He knew I'd seen. He told me that if I said anything, he'd have me deported. He'd make sure I lost everything. She wiped her eyes. I was a coward. I stayed silent. Kept working for your father for another 5 years, watching him and Caroline pretend to grieve. Watching them eventually get married after a decent interval. Watching you grow up thinking your mother's death was just a terrible accident. Margaret processed this. Her father, Richard Chen, had married Caroline, his dead wife's sister, 3 years after Helen's death. Everyone had thought it was sweet in a way. 2 people finding comfort in shared grief. It had been guilt and cover-up. Why did you send the cards? Margaret asked. Because I couldn't stay completely silent, Elizabeth said. I left your father's employment in 1990, moved away, tried to build a life. But I couldn't forget what I'd seen. Couldn't forget your mother. So I sent the cards, every year, to remind myself, and maybe somehow you, that someone remembered, that the truth was still out there, even if I was too afraid to speak it. She reached across the table, took Margaret's hand. But I'm dying now, and I can't let this die with me. You deserve to know what happened to your mother. She deserves justice, even if it's 40 years too late. Margaret looked at the elderly woman, frail, sick, carrying this terrible secret for decades. Do you have proof? Margaret asked. Besides your testimony? Elizabeth nodded slowly. I took something. That night. I was so scared, and I thought, maybe someday I'd be brave enough to use it. She stood shakily, walked to a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a photograph. Margaret's breath caught. It was a photo of her father and Caroline taken that same Christmas Eve, before the party. They were in her father's study, embracing. Not the hug of family members, the embrace of lovers. Time stamped on the bottom, December 24th, 1985, 6:47 p.m. Hours before Helen's death. I took it with the camera your father had left in the kitchen, Elizabeth explained. I'd seen them together earlier that day, and something told me to document it. I didn't know your mother would die that night, But when she did, when I realized what they'd done, I kept it. As insurance, maybe. As evidence. She handed Margaret another envelope, and I wrote down everything I saw, every detail, dates, times, conversations I overheard. I've kept it all these years. Margaret looked at the evidence, the photo, the detailed written account, 36 years of Christmas cards that established a pattern of memory and witness. What do you want me to do with this? Margaret asked quietly. I want you to decide, Elizabeth said. It's your mother, your family. Your choice whether to pursue this. But I wanted you to have the truth. After all these years of wondering who sent those cards, of not knowing, you deserve to finally know. Margaret spent the next week investigating. She talked to people who'd been at the party that night. Most remembered it vaguely. It had been 40 years ago. But a few remembered details. Remembered that Helen had seemed upset earlier in the evening, that Caroline had followed her upstairs, that Richard had been oddly calm after his wife's death, had discouraged people from calling for a more thorough investigation. Margaret found the old police report. Minimal investigation. Ruled accidental almost immediately. No autopsy beyond the basics. Her father had been a prominent businessman in 1985. The police had taken his word for what happened. Margaret also discovered that Richard and Caroline had married in 1988, finding comfort in shared loss. The wedding announcement had said they were still married, still living in the same house where Helen had died. The house where Margaret had grown up, not knowing her mother had been murdered there. Margaret made a decision. December 24th, 2025, 40 years to the day after Helen Chen's death. The family was gathering for Christmas Eve dinner at Richard and Caroline's house. The same stairs. Margaret arrived with a box. Her father greeted her at the door, older now, in his 80s. Caroline was in the kitchen, still beautiful in her 70s, still playing the role of devoted wife. The whole family was there, Margaret's cousins, her uncle, various relatives who'd been part of the Chen family circle for decades. They gathered in the dining room. Richard raised a glass for the traditional Christmas Eve toast. To family, he began. Wait, Margaret said, standing. Before we toast, I have something to share. She placed the box on the table. 40 years ago tonight, Margaret said, her voice steady, my mother died in this house, fell down those stairs. She pointed to the staircase visible from the dining room. Everyone said it was an accident, and I believed that. For 40 years I believed that. The room had gone quiet. Margaret opened the box. But for 35 years I've been receiving these. She pulled out the Christmas cards. All 36 of them. Laid them out on the table in chronological order. 35 years of cards, all saying the same thing. I remember. I never knew who sent them. Until this year. She showed them the most recent card. Your mother didn't fall. She was pushed. Caroline had gone pale. Richard's hand shook, his wine glass trembling. This year, I met the person who sent these cards, Margaret continued. Elizabeth Park, our former housekeeper. The woman who witnessed what really happened Christmas Eve, 1985. She pulled out Elizabeth's written statement. Elizabeth saw my mother discover my father and Aunt Caroline having an affair. She saw my mother confront them. She saw Caroline push my mother down the stairs. And she saw my father help cover it up. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. That's ridiculous, Richard started. She has proof, Margaret interrupted. She placed the photograph on the table. This was taken December 24th, 1985, at 6:47 p.m., hours before my mother died. It shows you and Caroline embracing, not as brother-in-law and sister-in-law, as lovers. Richard stared at the photo, his face ashen. Caroline stood abruptly. This is insane. It was 40 years ago. She fell. It was an accident. It was murder, Margaret said, her voice rising. You pushed her. And then you married her husband. You've been living in her house, sleeping in her bed, pretending to be the grieving sister who found comfort with the widower. For 40 years. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but her voice remained steady. You murdered my mother, and you got away with it, because Elizabeth was too afraid to speak up, because the police didn't investigate thoroughly, because my father was rich and connected enough to make it all go away quietly. She looked at her father. You helped her cover it up. You threatened Elizabeth into silence. You let me grow up thinking my mother's death was a tragic accident when you knew it was murder. Richard seemed to age before her eyes. His hands were shaking. Margaret, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Margaret said coldly. I understand that you valued your affair more than my mother's life. That when she threatened to expose you, you chose protecting your reputation over getting her justice. She gathered the cards, the photo, Elizabeth's statement. I've already contacted the police. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder. Elizabeth has agreed to testify, despite her fear. And I have 40 years of documentation showing someone has been trying to keep this truth alive all along. She looked around the table at her family, some shocked, some crying, all staring at Richard and Caroline with new horror. 40 years ago you murdered my mother and covered it up, Margaret said. Tonight, on the anniversary of her death, I'm making sure everyone knows the truth. She walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Those Christmas cards said, I remember. Well, now everyone will remember. What you did. What you've gotten away with for 40 years. That ends tonight. Margaret walked out, leaving chaos behind her. The investigation that followed was complicated by time, but not impossible. Elizabeth's testimony was detailed and credible. The photograph established the affair. Margaret's 36 years of cards established a pattern of someone trying to preserve the truth. The old police report was reopened. Details that had been dismissed in 1985 were examined more closely. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Caroline was charged with manslaughter. At her age, with the time that had passed, the case was difficult. But the evidence was damning enough that she eventually pled guilty to criminally negligent homicide to avoid trial. She received a suspended sentence due to her age and health, but her reputation was destroyed. The family that had embraced her as Richard's second wife turned away. Richard wasn't charged criminally. The statute of limitations had run on accessory after the fact. But the civil lawsuit Margaret filed for wrongful death and emotional distress was successful. She donated the settlement to domestic violence organizations. The family fractured. Some believed Margaret supported her, cut ties with Richard and Caroline. Others thought she was dredging up old pain unnecessarily, that some things should stay buried. Margaret didn't care. Her mother deserved the truth, deserved justice, even 40 years late. Elizabeth Park died 3 months after Margaret's Christmas Eve revelation. Margaret was with her at the end, holding her hand. Thank you, Margaret whispered, for remembering, for all those years, for finally being brave enough to tell me. Elizabeth smiled weakly. Your mother was a good woman. She deserved better than what they did to her. I'm sorry I waited so long. You were afraid, Margaret said. I understand. But I didn't forget, Elizabeth said. I never forgot. I know, Margaret said, squeezing her hand. I have 36 Christmas cards that prove it. Elizabeth closed her eyes peacefully. The following December, Margaret opened her mailbox expecting nothing. But inside was a vintage Christmas card. Her heart stopped. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, in her own handwriting, was a message. I remember. Margaret realized she'd sent it to herself, a continuation of Elizabeth's tradition, a promise to her mother that she wouldn't be forgotten. She placed it in the wooden box with the others, 37 cards now. 36 from Elizabeth, 1 from Margaret. I remember. Her mother, the truth, the justice that came too late but came nonetheless. Margaret hung the card on her Christmas tree, not hiding it away but displaying it proudly. A reminder that silence protects the guilty. That truth matters, even decades later. That someone always remembers, even when it feels like the world has moved on. Helen Chen had been murdered on Christmas Eve 1985. For 40 years, one person had remembered and kept the truth alive through anonymous cards. Now everyone knew. And Margaret would make sure they never forgot. I remember.